Hey, it's Jer. On today's show, I chat with author Angie Schmitt. Her book, Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America, looks at how our built environment and our choices to buy ever larger vehicles have led to more inequity and more pedestrian deaths to the point that it's a public health crisis. We'll dive in and talk about a change the city of Detroit made to make things far better for those who walk and bike. But first on your Daily Detroit for Tuesday, October 13th, 2020, 3 things to know. The state of Michigan is continuing to see an increased number of coronavirus cases, with more than 1,200 new cases in the last 24 hours. That's coupled with 30 deaths. There have been more than 137,700 cases and 6,928 fatalities since the pandemic started. Locally, Macomb County continues to be the hottest spot in southeast Michigan for virus infections, with cases per 100,000 people over the last 7 days increasing. Statewide, the virus is spreading at an alarming pace throughout the Upper Peninsula. The city of Detroit gave the media a chance to check in on a large drainage project on Oakman Boulevard today. The nearly mile-long, $8.6 million green stormwater median in the Aviation subdivision is turning what was just grass and cement into bioretention gardens to capture more than 37 million gallons of stormwater each year. That water used to flow into storm sewers and back up into residents' basements. Bioretention gardens kind of look like rain gardens at first blush, but if you dig down, there's work underneath, so it's designed to slowly soak up stormwater. The Detroit Water and Sewerage Department is installing underground box-shaped chambers beneath 8 of the bioretention areas in the median to temporarily store stormwater and then slowly, over time, release it to the combined sewer system. In some places, catch basin connections are being rerouted from the combined sewer lines to new storm sewer pipes, and new mains are being installed as needed. Up in Sterling Heights, their clerk is extending the hours on their election center. The city has seen increased demand, issuing more than 35,000 absent voter ballots and processing between 60 and 70 voter registrations per day, according to their clerk, Melanie Riska. To give you perspective, the city of more than 130,000 people has about 105,000 adults, so that is a large chunk of voters going absentee. Now, through the November 3rd election center hours will be Monday from 9 to 5, Tuesday from 9 to 7 p.m., Wednesday from 9 to 5, Thursday from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m., Friday from 9 to 5, and then on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., so open 6 days a week. There, Sterling Heights residents will be able to register to vote, apply for and obtain an absent voter ballot, and drop off their ballot. The election center is located at their Senior Center South entrance at 40200 Utica Road. Joining me on the line is Angie Schmitt. She is an author and principal at 3MPH. That's her consultancy. She is out with a book that I thought was important to highlight to listeners because, this is the Motor City, but people forget that we have such a high percentage of people in our area that are without a car or carless households. So the book that she's written is Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. Angie Schmitt, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So my first question, and this is maybe a reflection of my own experience, is how did you get into this topic? Because I tend to find people who become passionate about urbanism in a way, pedestrians, making sure our streets are balanced for all people. They tend to usually have a story about how they became aware of this. So kind of what's yours? How did you get into this?
I was a reporter for a number of years at an organization called Streets Blog that's based in New York, and we did advocacy journalism for better walking, biking, and transit across the country. So 9 years is a long time to sort of be on a beat like that, and I just learned so much. I started to, really build up a lot of knowledge about these kind of things. I thought this was a little bit pedestrian safety was a little bit underexplored and compared to like cycling, because about 10 times as many people are killed walking every year in the United States as people biking.
Going through this book, and I found it a very interesting read, that some of the choices that we have made as a society have kind of enhanced the number of deaths or increased the number of deaths and created some of these worse outcomes for people who walk on our streets. There's things that we've talked about on the show before, like the shift to SUVs, things like that, but those are actually having real world impacts with actual people in the streets, right?
Right, yeah. So there's been this big change in the vehicle mix in the United States. After the last recession in about 2012, about 75% of the vehicles being sold, new vehicles, were sedans, right? So like a car. But now the latest numbers show it's about reverse. So there's been this enormous shift. Now 75% of vehicles being sold are crossovers, SUVs, or pickups. So vehicles have gotten bigger, they've gotten heavier, and they have higher front ends now. And that is bad news for pedestrians. There's a lot of evidence that shows SUVs are 2.5 to 3 times more likely to kill pedestrians when they hit them.
Well, and there is a photo in the book that is both adorable and terrifying at the same time of your 4-year-old next to one of those giant large trucks that consumers are buying nowadays. His head barely gets to the bumper, and then it just like kind of towers over him, and it kind of gives a lot of scale, as well as some photos of you with different cars. And it seems like the way that cars strike people has also increased the amount of injuries that we've had.
Yeah, that high front end, especially in recent years, pickup trucks have just gotten so gigantic, and they have this very high flat front end. My son in the photo, he barely comes up to the bumper at 4 years old. And it creates big blind zones, both in front of and behind the car. There's been little experiments done where as many as 50 children can sit in the blind zone in front of, they used an SUV in that experiment, and they were all like completely invisible.
So one of the things that kind of puzzles me just personally, maybe it's because I live in a city or I'm not sure, but the thing for me is that I see a lot of these large SUVs and trucks, but I mean, I don't see lots of people using an F-250 to its potential, right? Like if you're a construction contractor, I totally understand it. But a lot of times I feel like these things are bought for consumer preference, for show, or just because people like it. I read some interesting passages in there around like the motivations that people have for picking up these vehicles. And I was wondering if you wanted to expand on that a little bit.
There's a guy years ago that wrote a really interesting book. His name was Keith Bradsher, about the rise of SUVs, sort of the last phase in the early 2000s. And he had some intel basically from the auto industry that showed that they sort of understood, they called it like reptilian, the kind of desires that were pushing people to buy these vehicles that had this capacity for like enormous violence. And he was saying it taps into some pretty messed up sort of impulses that people have like deep in their psyche, that there's a lot of fear of crime and people want to be able to. It was what these executives or these advertising marketing folks at Chrysler back in the 1990s were sort of pointing out.
Wow. Well, I feel that there are some kind of echoes to what the discourse is in the country right now, because if you look at what's happening with ads and things like that, so much of it is around fear, and the messaging is fear. And it kind of strikes me like America is pretty much the most fortunate country on the face of this earth, yet it seems like we have a lot of people who are afraid of something, and I'm not quite exactly sure what.
Yeah, well, I think obviously our society's sort of splintering right now. We've got all kinds of issues with racism and segregation, right? And a lot of irrational fears around that. But in the book, what they said was that the reason Americans are very fearful, even though crime has been declining for a while, is because we consume so much violent media, is what they said. So when we watch television shows that have a lot of crime or like have a high-speed chase, for example, that really influences the way we view the world.
Well, and as somebody who used to work with local news, I know that the story selection of traditional local news definitely leans towards those kind of violent stories at the front, right? To try to keep people hooked and interested, even though it's not necessarily the news that will actually impact you or really make a difference, in your community. And also tends to kind of stereotype minority groups. And speaking of minority groups, I also noticed in there that this has a huge disproportionate impact on people of color, this kind of lack of pedestrian focus or pedestrian thinking when planning cities.
That's one of the themes of the book, is that people of color, Black, Latino folks, Native folks are all at increased risk, especially Native Americans. And I talk a lot about why in the book. And one reason is because of discrimination, right? In the wealth gap, people of color are less likely to own vehicles. So they're more likely to be walking or taking transit in the first place. I mean, I think that that's going to be really apparent in a place like Detroit. If you looked at the vehicles in households by race, I'm sure there'd be an enormous disparity. But another thing that's going on is that Black and brown neighborhoods have been passed over for needed safety improvements. And we see this all over the country. But the example I use in my book is Portland. So there's some really stark disparities, even in a city like that, that's really prioritized this kind of street safety stuff.
Well, and personally, and this is just my own personal anecdote, I have a uncle of mine, he's now passed on, who was a suburban mayor, and he signed off on a development of a major road here intentionally without sidewalks to intentionally make sure that people of color didn't come into his city. Like he straight out said that in the 1980s. And so we can't discount that. Like that active, not just passive, like passing things over, but there's a lot of evidence, at least in my work, seeing that there is active evidence that decisions are made to make things more difficult for pedestrians and bicyclists and things like that.
That's a really good point.
One bright spot, though, that I did notice, and I've got to call it out because, you know, we're in Detroit. I try to look for something positive, is the impact of increased street lights in the city. As somebody who lived here before the street lights, I remember how dark it was and how many didn't work. And now living near a street where I can see literally 20 of them down the road, it's something where it has really made a difference from the looks and personal side of it, but you were able to find more that made even more of an impact on the street for people.
Yeah, Detroit is actually a big success story that I use in all. I'm traveling around the country giving presentations right now. I'm going to give one later today to a group of folks nationally, and I use this example of Detroit streetlights as a really promising strategy. Prior to 2014, I don't know how well versed people are in Detroit about this, but 40% of the streetlights were not working. $185 million in bonds were issued, and all those were repaired over a period of 2 years. And after that happened, pedestrian deaths sort of fell off a cliff. They declined 35% in Detroit, even though throughout the state of Michigan, they were increasing at a rapid clip. I have to credit the local organization Detroit Greenways for tracking this information and pointing it out. But the number of deaths that happened in dark, unlighted conditions in Detroit went from around 20, maybe more than 20 a year, to just one. So we're practically eliminated overnight. So I think that's been an underappreciated, underexplored aspect of urban life in general, because that project wasn't really even about pedestrian safety. It was about, personal safety and quality of life in the city of Detroit, and yet it had these unintended benefits.
Yeah, and I can tell you as a person who lived through that, it made a huge difference just in the perception of the city in general. I know to some people it might seem silly, but that one thing is one of, I think, the building blocks that has been supporting some of the positive energy that we've seen as late. For me, I like to leave listeners with a few things that maybe they can think about or do, maybe 2 or 3 that in their daily lives that they can kind of step forward as they're reading this book and make some changes or get involved somehow to make life better for pedestrians. Do you kind of have any feedback on that, on what people can do?
So if you live in an area where you're not in the habit of walking anywhere, and a lot of people are in that position in the United States, I would encourage you to try it, to try and experience what the streets around you are like on foot. And if you do notice problems, whether you're already doing some walking or not, some of this stuff is just sort of like civic 101. Reach out to your council member, write an email, sign a petition, or get involved if there's an advocacy group. I know there's a few in Detroit. Get involved with them. They're trying to help build power for the type of changes that are needed. I think one of the things that's needed is just a reframing around this. So if we, every time a pedestrian's killed, just say, oh, well, they weren't in a crosswalk, we're never going to get anywhere with this. And that's what we've been doing. So just listening to something like this and changing the way we think about it is really an important first step, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I think about the way that these stories get told, whether on social media or they're reported out. They say, well, maybe somebody is in a crosswalk, but maybe, especially in suburban areas, they'll conveniently forget that there's not another crosswalk for another half mile or mile. And that makes it very difficult for elderly people, for people who are disabled, or just people in general. It just makes it very difficult to deal with your lived environment. It's something that's, I think, kind of stunning. And I love that suggestion of that people should walk around their neighborhoods and see what it's really like.
I think that one of the big problems with this is a lot of the people who are influential, right, in a place like Detroit are privileged enough that they're never put in the position of waiting for the bus next to high-speed arterial with two kids, maybe when it's dark, when it's 5:30 in the winter. So I think that's one reason it's been overlooked, and we haven't been very sympathetic in the past.
I think that's very true. I mean, even talking to folks in my own local reporting, it's clear that a number, not all, but a good number, they've never ridden a bus before. They've never had, and let alone relied on it for transportation or to get to work. And so what ends up happening, I think, is you get these solutions for where to put a bus station or how to route something where it's like it was designed by somebody who looks at buses or looks at, like, we have this streetcar called the Q line that doesn't go very far. Like, they look at it and they go, well, it looks like the right solution, but they don't actually live it. They've never walked it. They don't know how long it takes to do things. So it's like this pretty looking solution, but it isn't really that functional when you get to actually using it.
Yeah, we've got to do a better job being more inclusive in our planning processes. One of the mistakes I think we've made is just designing for a certain person with a certain person in mind, like the normal person, a guy that maybe drives to work on a highway from the suburbs every day is sort of maybe who the DOT has in mind that they're designing for. And I think there's such a huge diversity in the way people operate that we're overlooking. And like ability status is something that doesn't get the attention it deserves. And, these racial issues are getting more attention now. But I think the average person is a lot more diverse than we give credit for.
Oh, yeah, especially across this country. The demographics, as we all know, are shifting. And in this region, if you look at the Tri-County, it's not just Detroit where people of color live. I mean, you look at the inner ring suburbs and things like that. Like,
right.
People live where they live, and poverty doesn't stop at a city line. I think there's this like belief in America a lot of times that, well, there's the city over there, but there's so many people who are locked in place to poverty because they're location locked. They can't get to jobs, and they're in the suburbs and things, but we don't think about them because that isn't where the usual narrative is. Maybe that's just my personal experience, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Something I write a lot about in the book is how we're having this suburbanization of poverty in the United States, and it's really stark. Sometimes I use these racial dot maps of Detroit in some of my presentations, and you can see back in the 90s how stark segregation was, and the 8 Mile Road is really clear in these images, but it's really broken down a lot over the last 20 years. There's still a lot of segregation, but there's been a big change in suburban areas. And I think when we get the new census results, it'll be even more apparent. A lot of suburban areas are really hostile to people on foot. So it can be a dangerous place to be poor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want people to seriously consider picking up this book, giving it a read. I found it to be really informative, and I just love your stories. The book is Right of Way, Race, Class, and the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. Angie Schmitt, thank you so much for being so generous with your time on Daily Detroit today. I
just wanted to say, if people do want to buy the book, there's a discount code you can use at the publisher, which is Island Press. You use my last name, which is Schmidt, SCHMITT. You can get it 20% off. And thank you so much for having me.
And that'll do it for your Tuesday show. Thank you so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. You know, our podcast is people-powered. It is the contributions of our members that allow us to be fierce, independent, reliable, and in your ears every single day. You can join the wonderful folks that are our members at patreon.com/dailydetroit. That's patreon.com/dailydetroit. If you want to add your voice to the show, leave us feedback at 313-789-3211. That's 313-789-3211. Or email me at jer@dailydetroit.com. I'm Jer Stays. Thanks for listening to Your Daily Detroit. Take care of each other, and we'll get through this together.